Ruth Mercer stood in the chapel aisle in her wedding dress while San Oro learned her groom had stolen her hymn and left her to hear it aloud. Abel Platt had sent a note instead of his face. He had taken the harvest choir post in Cerro Bend, taken the song Ruth wrote for their wedding, and left her with nothing but a dress full of witnesses. Ruth was not crying. That was the first thing Silas Crowe noticed from the back bench, where his two boys sat straight as fence posts beside him. Her gloved hands folded over a small packet of hymn sheets, her plain ivory dress already dusty at the hem from the long walk between the boarding house and church. Her brown hair was pinned neat beneath a narrow veil. She looked 30 or so, old enough to know the shape of trouble and too proud to let the town see her knees fail. Mrs. Klein had come in from the side door carrying Abel's folded note like it might bite her. The school board men leaned forward. Reverend Ames read at once, and his mouth tightened. "Miss Mercer," he said quietly, "Mr. Platt says the hymn you wrote for this morning will serve Cerro Bend better. He says he cannot proceed with the marriage." The chapel did not go silent. It rustled. That was worse. Silk sleeves whispered, boots shifted. Someone near the front made a pitying sound and then swallowed it. Ruth's fingers closed over the hymn packet. "He took my song and left me the dress." No one answered. Abel had been in San Oro 6 months, long enough to charm the school board with his fine tenor voice and his clean black coat. He had told the town Ruth was coming from Pueblo to marry him and help build a proper choir. Now the men who had praised him looked at the floorboards as if shame might pass if they gave it room. "If you behave sensibly," Mrs. Klein said, too loudly, "you can take the noon stage." Ruth turned toward her. "My room is paid through Tuesday." Mrs. Klein's eyes slid toward the board men. Under the circumstances, paid rooms may not settle what people will say. If Ruth took that stage, she would leave with no husband, no wages, no room after Tuesday, and no proof the song was hers. Then her hymn packet hit the floor. Someone's elbow had caught it when Ruth stepped down from the aisle. Papers slipped, white wings scattering over the chapel boards. Abel's note lay on top of them. One woman lifted her skirt so the papers would not touch it. A bored man stepped over Abel's note as if Ruth's name on it might stain his boot, and the whole chapel watched the abandoned bride bend alone. Silas felt Jonah's move beside him, not much. A boy's boot shifting half an inch, enough. Silas let go of Eli's shoulder and crossed the aisle. He picked up the first sheet and handed it to Ruth. Then the next. Then the next. He did not kneel like a suitor. He did not touch her glove. He simply made it impossible for the whole town to pretend she was bending by herself. That was why Silas had been leaving before hymns for 4 years. His wife had died on a winter evening with a hymn half-written on her lap, and after that the Crowe house went quiet in a way no door could fix. Jonah's 11 had once sung clear enough to stop hired hands chewing. Eli 9 had followed every note his brother carried. Now both boys kept their mouths shut as if singing were a stove too hot to touch. "Mrs. Klein," he said, "you got Widow Rusk boarding in your back room." "She is there," Mrs. Klein said. "Good. Miss Mercer can take a paid day's work at my ranch if she wants it. My boys need music lessons in the open hay yard, with Widow Rusk sitting where any fool can see propriety has both boots on." That made the board men look up. Ruth stared at him. "Your boys walked out before the hymn. That is the trouble I am hiring for. I am not looking for another claim. I did not offer one." Silas took a pencil from his vest and tore the clean back from Abel's note. He wrote slowly because everyone watched slowly. $1 a day for breath and song lessons. Work to be done in open yard. Widow Rusk present, no courtship promised or owed. Miss Mercer may stop any day she chooses. He signed it and held it out. Ruth read every word. Her face changed at the last line, not softening exactly, but finding ground. "You do not even know if I can teach. I know Abel Platt thought your song was worth stealing." The first sound Ruth made was not quite a laugh. It cut once and stopped. And she folded the paper and put it beside her hymns. "One day," she said. "One day," Silas agreed. Jonas and Eli said nothing on the ride to Crowe Ranch. Ruth sat on the wagon bench between Widow Rusk and a sack of oats, her wedding dress gathered so the wheels would not catch it. The San Oro Valley opened around them, yellow hay meadows under a hard blue Colorado sky, the Sangre de Cristo peak standing pale in the distance. Silas drove without fuss. He did not ask how long she had known Abel. He did not say she was better off. Men who said that usually meant a woman should be grateful for scraps. At the ranch, the hay yard lay wide and public between the barn, the bunkhouse, and the kitchen porch. Widow Rusk planted herself in a chair with her knitting and a stare sharp enough to shave bark. The hired hands made a business of mending harness close by. Ruth faced the boys. I am not going to ask you to sing, she said. Eli looked surprised. Jonas looked suspicious. Then what are we paying for? Jonas asked. His voice had a rough edge from disuse, but it was a voice. Breath first. Songs are just breath brave enough to be heard. Silas turned toward the barn so the boys would not catch him listening too hard. Ruth placed 3 hay hooks on a barrel. Tap once when you breathe in, tap twice when you let it out. No tune, no words. Jonas folded his arms. Eli tapped once. Ruth tapped with him. She did not smile like she had won a battle. She just matched him. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, tap. After a while, Jonas took the 3rd hook and struck it against the barrel so hard the hired hands looked over. That is not breath, Ruth said. It is what I have. Then we will start there. By sundown, Eli had learned to count 4 beats without looking at his brother, and Jonas had stopped trying to break the barrel. Ruth's dress hem was streaked with hay dust. Silas paid her the $1 in front of Widow Rusk and the hands. Ruth accepted it with 2 fingers like a wage, not charity. Tomorrow. Eli asked before he could stop himself. Ruth looked to Silas. Silas looked to Jonas. Jonas stared at the mountains, jaw tight. She did not make us sing. That was not an answer, Eli said. It was near enough, Ruth said. Near the lower road, a schoolboy slowed his mule and stared at Ruth's dusty wedding dress. By supper, San Oro would know the abandoned bride was teaching breath in Crowe's hay yard. The second day, Abel Platt rode up the lane wearing the black coat he should have worn to his wedding. Silas met him at the yard gate. Ruth stayed by the barrel with the boys and Widow Rusk, but her hand went to the hymn packet tucked under her arm. Crowe, Abel said, smiling as if the ranch were a stage and he had entered on cue. I hear you took charge of my difficulty. I hired a teacher. You hired a disappointed woman in a bridal dress. San Oro is generous with gossip. Then San Oro can learn wages. Abel's smile thinned. Those hymns were written for my voice. Ruth stepped forward. They were written by my hand. For our wedding. There was no wedding. Abel glanced at the boys. Careful, Ruth. A woman left at the altar cannot afford to sound bitter. The school board asked me to lead the harvest sing. If you behave sensibly, I might still recommend you for sewing or copying work. Quiet work. Eli moved behind Jonas. Silas saw it. Abel saw it too and used it. And you, Crowe, should remember the church meadow lease renews at harvest. A man who brings scandal to the chapel may find his cattle short on grass. That meadow fed Crowe cattle through the dry month. Lose it, and Silas would sell stock before winter or watch his boys count empty stalls. Silas's hands stayed loose. You ride off my place now. Abel tipped his hat to Ruth. Think on what your voice is worth without someone respectable to carry it. After he left, the hay yard felt smaller. Ruth lifted a hay hook and tapped once. Breathe in. No one moved. She tapped twice. Let it out. Eli copied her. Jonas did not. Silas went to the barn and put both hands on a stall rail until the wish to strike Abel had somewhere to die. 2 mornings later, Ruth walked to the little schoolroom beside the chapel and found the door bolted. Mrs. Klein stood there with a shawl tight around her shoulders. The board thinks it best that you not use public rooms until matters settle. My hymn packet is inside. Mr. Platt collected loose music for the harvest rehearsal. Ruth's face went still. Those are mine. He said they were church property. And you believed him. Mrs. Klein looked away. I believed the man with a contract. Her fingers worried the boarding house key at her waist. Abel had not only taken Ruth's papers, he had taught frightened people what silence would buy. On the chapel post hung a fresh handbill, Harvest Sing, led by Abel Platt. Beneath it, in smaller writing, was a warning that unsuitable persons would not be allowed near the children or the organ. Ruth read it once. She took the nail out of the post, folded the handbill, and carried it to Crowe Ranch without tearing it. Silas was hitching a team when she arrived. He saw the paper in her hand and the absence of the hymn packet under her arm. I can have you on the Trinidad stage by noon, he said. Ruth looked past him to where the boys stood in the hay yard. Eli held a hay hook. Jonas held nothing, which meant he had been waiting. Is that what you would do? She asked. If a whole town set itself to chewing on me, maybe. No, you would stay until it cost too much, and then stay 1 day longer because your boys were watching. Silas had no answer for that. Ruth held up the handbill. He has my packet. He has the schoolroom. He wants the harvest song. I have my memory and a torn dress. A torn dress? She looked down at the ivory hem, stained now with dust and hay. A bride dress is not much use to me. In the open yard, with the hired hands and widow Rusk watching. Ruth took Silas's pocket knife from the barrel where he had laid it. For one breath, she held the knife above the cleanest part of the dress, the last piece of the morning that had not been used against her. Then she cut 3 narrow strips from her wedding hem. The sound made Eli flinch. Jonas stared. "White for breathe in," she said, tying one strip to a hay hook. "Dusty for let out, torn for begin again." "You ruined it," Eli whispered. "No," Ruth said. "I changed its work." That afternoon the boys learned the first line without words. Ruth hummed low, not pretty, not performing. Eli followed under his breath. Jonas stood apart until Silas, mending a trace, heard his older son hum the last note like a man testing ice. Silas did not turn. He knew better than to scare a first sound back into hiding. The next day, Abel struck harder. He came with 2 board men and a paper saying the Crowe Church Meadow lease would be delayed until the scandal around Miss Mercer was resolved. He did not hand the paper to Ruth. He handed it to Silas, making sure she watched. "Send her away," Abel said. "Let me lead the harvest sing with the music she wrote, and the board will consider this a misunderstanding." Ruth stood with hay dust on her skirt and the torn hem showing at her ankles. No veil now, no packet, no borrowed dignity. "And if I say in church that the hymns are mine?" Abel smiled. "Without the papers, Ruth, you will look like a bride who lost a groom and made a story to keep attention." Mrs. Klein stood behind the board men. She would not meet Ruth's eyes. Jonas stepped forward. "She wrote the new part yesterday." One hired hand looked at Jonas, then at Abel, and stopped leaning on his shovel. Abel looked down at him. "Children repeat what lonely adults teach them." The boy's mouth shut. Silas felt that like a gate slamming. Ruth did too. She moved between Abel and Jonas, not close enough to threaten, only enough to draw Abel's eyes back to the adult he was hurting. "You can take paper," she said. "You can take rooms, you can write my shame in small letters on a handbill, but you cannot make stolen breath sound clean." Abel laughed then, and several hired hands heard it. At dusk, Silas brought the old reed-organ stool from the house. It had belonged to his wife. For 4 years it sat under a flour sack in the parlor, not because it was holy, but because touching it made the room fill with all the things he had failed to say before she died. He carried it to the hay yard and set it beside Ruth. Jonas went pale. "Pa. Your mother used this to reach the petals," Silas said. "It is a stool, it can work." Ruth touched the edge of it gently. "We do not have to use it." "I know," Silas said. Eli sat on it first. He put both feet flat on the dirt and breathed in. Jonas stood behind him. Ruth tied the last strip of wedding hem around the stool leg. "No words unless you choose," she said. Eli hummed the first line. Jonas joined on the second. Silas turned away too late. Ruth saw his face before he could hide it. She did not offer comfort. She lifted her hand, counted 2 beats, and gave the boys room to finish. On Harvest Sunday, San Oro Chapel filled until men stood outside the open windows. Abel had dressed in black again. He placed Ruth's stolen hymn sheets on the reed organ as if ownership were a matter of arranging paper. The corrected handbill still named him. The collection purse hung from Reverend Ames's chair, meant for church roof repair and choir expenses. Ruth sat in the back beside Widow Rusk. Her dress was no longer a wedding dress in any honest sense. The hem was uneven where lesson strips had been cut away, and hay dust had settled into the seams. She looked more like a woman who had survived a week of work than one who had been spared anything. Silas sat with Jonas and Eli. For the first time in 4 years, he did not stand when the sermon ended. People noticed. Ruth saw heads turn. Abel saw it too, and triumph flashed across his face as if he had made even grief obey him. "Today," Abel announced, "we offer a harvest hymn prepared for this congregation through my direction." Ruth rose. The chapel held its breath. Reverend Ames looked at her, then at Abel. "Miss Mercer." "Before Mr. Platt leads," Ruth said, "I ask leave for 2 boys to choose whether the song he carries is the song they learned. The line they learned yesterday is not in that packet. If Mr. Platt owns the song, let him lead what he has never heard." Abel's voice sharpened. "This is not a children's exhibition." Jonas stood. Silas's hand opened on the bench, but he did not pull the boy back. Eli stood beside his brother. Ruth did not walk to the organ. She stayed where the whole room could see that the choice did not come from her hand on their shoulders. "Jonas, Eli, whose song will you carry?" Abel struck the first chord hard. It was Ruth's melody, but he dragged it grand and proud, smoothing the ache out of it until nothing true remained. Eli looked at Jonas. Jonas swallowed. His face was white. Then he sang one plain line, rough from 4 years of silence. Bring in the hay, bring in the rain. Eli joined him, softer but steady. Bring every lost voice home again. Ruth's eyes closed for one beat. When she opened them, she sang the third line with them, the line Abel had not stolen because she had made it in the hay yard after the packet was gone. Hands that were empty can gather the grain. One bored man looked down at the stolen packet on the organ and understood before he wanted to. Silas stood not to leave, but because his sons were singing and his legs could not stay folded under that mercy. Widow Rusk joined first from the back, old voice cracked and fearless. A hired hand at the window followed. Then Reverend Ames. Then a woman near the aisle who had watched Ruth bend alone a week before and had not helped. Abel played louder. His hands struck the keys harder, but his face had lost the song. The congregation sang louder than him. He stopped the organ. The silence he expected did not come. Widow Rusk's cracked voice carried the next note, and a hired hand outside the window took off his hat. The song kept going without him. That was when his face changed, not to guilt. Abel Platt was not a man built for guilt. It changed to fear because a room that had followed him for 6 months had found another lead and did not ask his permission. When the last line ended, Reverend Ames stepped down from the pulpit. "Mr. Platt," he said, "remove your hands from the organ." Abel stood. "You cannot mean to take the word of an abandoned woman and 2 grieving boys over a signed contract." Mrs. Klein made a small sound. Ruth looked at her, so did half the chapel. The boarding-house widow's cheeks flushed. "Miss Mercer paid her room and board herself," Mrs. Klein said, voice trembling. "Mr. Platt told me to say otherwise if she made trouble. He promised the board would favor my license renewal." One of the board men cursed under his breath. Reverend Ames took the stolen hymn packet from the organ. "These will be returned." "They were written for me," Abel said. "Then you should have had the courage to stand beside the woman who wrote them." Silas walked to the front, but he stopped short of Ruth. This was hers. He would not crowd it. Ruth held out her hand. Reverend Ames placed the packet in it. She took the top sheet, turned it over, and wrote the new third line from memory. Then she handed it back. "For the roof," she said, "not for him." The Reverend nodded. He removed the harvest handbill from the wall, crossed Abel's name with one firm stroke, and wrote Ruth Mercer, choir teacher, temporary until town vote. Abel watched his own name disappear under the Reverend's stroke. "Not temporary," Widow Rusk called from the back. "Vote now." People laughed, not cruelly, but with the relief of a room learning it had a spine. The board men conferred in a tight, angry knot. The meadow lease paper Abel had waved at Silas was torn in half and handed back to him without a signature. The collection purse was lifted from Abel's side before he could touch it. The board man folded the meadow lease and kept it out of Abel's reach. Then the purse was placed between Ruth and Reverend Ames on the organ bench. Abel looked toward the door. No one moved to follow him. No one offered his hat. No one asked him to lead the closing hymn. He walked out alone, carrying nothing but the black coat he had thought made him respectable. Reverend Ames did not let the room soften into murmurs. "Mr. Calder," he said to the oldest board man, "you held the meadow lease over Mr. Crowe this morning. Say now whether church grass is for cattle or for punishing women." Calder's ears reddened. He took the torn lease paper from Abel's empty chair and held both halves where the congregation could see them. "Crowe lease stands through winter." "And the choir money." The second board man untied the collection purse with clumsy fingers. "Roof repair first, teacher wages second, no private handling by Mr. Platt." "Mrs." Klein stepped into the aisle like each board creaked her name. She took one step away from the board men before she said it, as if choosing which side of the aisle would remember her. "I have Miss Mercer's account book entry at the boarding house," she said. "It says paid. I let folks think otherwise because Abel promised my license would pass easy." Ruth did not thank her, not yet. Some truths deserved room to stand without being petted. "Read it next Sunday," Ruth said. Mrs. Klein swallowed. "I will." Only then did the room breathe again. Hats lowered. Women looked at Ruth directly instead of around her. One ranch hand who had laughed at Abel's first rehearsals took off his gloves and laid them on the organ bench beside the collection purse, a wordless promise to help mend the roof without taking orders from a thief. Ruth did not sit down. Her knees wanted it, but she stayed standing until Jonas and Eli reached her. Eli touched the torn strip tied around his wrist. Was that singing? Ruth smiled then, the first full smile Silas had seen on her. That was choosing. Jonas looked at his father. "Can we stay to the end?" Silas's throat worked. "I reckon we have already started." The town vote was not proper. but San Oro had never been overburdened with proper when feeling ran high. The time the church bell rang noon, Ruth had a paid post teaching harvest choir and children's breathing lessons twice a week. Mrs. Klein lost her place on the music committee and kept her boarding house license only after she wrote Ruth's account clear in the ledger and said aloud that the abandoned bride had owed her nothing. Silas paid Ruth for the week in front of Reverend Ames, widow Rusk, the board, the boys, and anyone else who needed education. "You do not have to come back to Crow Ranch," he said. "No," Ruth said, folding the money into her glove. "I do not." He nodded once. It cost him, but he nodded. That evening, after the chapel emptied and the town carried its gossip home in a changed basket, Ruth rode out to Crow Ranch in Widow Rusk's wagon. She had her hymn packet on her lap, her wages in her glove, and no veil at all. Silas was mending a hinge on the kitchen door when she arrived. Jonas and Eli were on the porch, pretending not to wait. "I am not asking for an answer tonight," Silas said. "Good," Ruth said. "I am tired of men asking questions after they have arranged the answer." She climbed from the wagon and walked to the porch. She took the strip of torn wedding hem from Eli's wrist, tied it around the Reed organ stool Silas had carried to the doorway, and opened her hymn packet. A week earlier, Ruth had bent alone for scattered hymns while San Oro watched. Now 2 boys carried her song into an open door, and no man's name stood over it but hers. Eli tapped the porch rail once. Jonas tapped twice. Silas waited in the yard with his hat in his hands, not claiming, not rushing. Ruth lifted her hand, and the Crow boys sang the harvest line home.